Welcome everyone, welcome Michael to the ConTEST 2021. I'm Akriti Shukla, your host for the session. It is great pleasure for me to host you. Today's speaker needs no introduction. He's co-author of Rapid Software Test Technology. He is one of the most influential and renowned personality in the world of software testing. Welcome to the session.
Here we are. And I'm here to tell you about an experience report. I'm going to give you an experience report, a story of working with an automator, somebody who is specializing in writing and developing a test automation framework. And what I'm going to keep coming back to is the idea that we are working in different worlds. Testers and automators, I contend, are working in different worlds because the world of an automator is the world of a programmer. Now, it, of course, is to some degree true that these worlds overlap to some degree in a single person. But it is my experience and observation that it's really, really hard to maintain both the tester's mindset and the developer's mindset and the automator's mindset in the same moment at the same time. It is very difficult to do that. And the reason it's very difficult to do that is because of the different worlds that these people inhabit and the different worlds that these people are trying to bridge. The world of the automator, the world of the programmer, is a convergent world. In general, programmers are trying to bridge the world of humans and the world of machines. That's what programmers try to do. They are like a lawyer when you're trying to work with the genie, because the genie will grant you whatever you wish for. But the genie will not necessarily grant you the wish you intended to wish for. The genie will grant you the wish that you explicitly said you wanted. So, for example, if you want lots of money, I want lots of money, and you find yourself in a room that is entirely filled with money and nothing else, and you can't get to the door. That's the sort of thing that can happen when the genie, that is to say the machinery, doesn't have an awareness of what you want. So you hire a lawyer, a person who talks to the genie and who understands the world of genies and who bridges the world of genies and regular people. But the lawyer, of course, has his or her own perspective on things. So that's what we're talking about. Now, I'm going to warn you of a couple of problems with this talk. One of them is it could be a 9-hour talk. We had so many rich experiences as a part of developing this, as I was trying to explain it to somebody who you may meet a little bit later today. This talk is an attempt to compress about a month's worth of experience into 55 minutes. It's not going to work very well in terms of all of the things that I encountered. There's going to be a lot I'm going to leave out, especially my own experience in trying to do the things that Michael Mintz was doing, just the little details. The other problem with this talk is there's going to be boring stuff here. No, not that kind of boring. This kind of boring. The kind of boring where you may well lose your interest and your initiative to stay engaged with it because there's a lot of fiddly technical details. But that is the life when we are working intimately closely with machines, and especially when we're trying to get them to do the things that people do rather than the things that machinery does. To get to the end before the beginning, there's a lot more to testing, far more to testing than just trying to get the machine to do stuff. Making the machine do things is not testing. Automating the GUI is not testing. For it to be testing, it needs to involve critical inquiry. It needs to involve the search for a problem. It needs to include investigation and consideration of risk. For it to be a test, we need to not only configure and operate the product, but we must observe it. And we must not only observe it, but we must also evaluate it. And the evaluation that we perform is not just a matter of applying decision rules. It's also a matter of applying social judgment to whether the machinery is solving the problem that it's intended to solve for the people for whom it has been programmed to solve those problems. So that is my kind of early introduction in every sense. Now, to go on with the story. The story begins as stories do, with once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a tester named James Bach, who is running a class called Rapid Software Testing Applied. And that's a class in which we take an application and we do a deep dive on it. And the target application for that class was a product called CryptPad Kanban. And this is what CryptPad Kanban is like. So I'm going to show you, go through a little video of CryptPad Kanban here. We open it up and get it started. It builds the interface. Oh, there's a little pop-up that shows up. So we click on that to make it go away. And then what it presents is Kanban cards, to-do list items. And we can type stuff into that. And we can modify the items that are already there. We can delete them. We can color them. We can add rich text to them. We can move them around. We can move them from one board to the next, or we can put them in the trash. Oh, there's another pop-up. Let's make that go away. Okay, and now we can change the names of the boards. That's a fairly straightforward thing to do. And so there we go. We can change the name of the board, and you'll notice that the product is keeping track of when you're editing it there. It's showing that up in the upper left-hand corner. And you can take items and you can move them from one board to the next. You can also add items to the bottom. So you can add an item there, and then you can add items to the top as well. So you can switch from adding to the bottom to adding to the top. And what else can we do? Well, if we look around, we can add new boards. That's another thing we can do. Pop over there, add a new board, put a title on it. And that's straightforward. And then there are a bunch of other features. There's a file menu over here with a bunch of options on that. There's a history option. That's a kind of cool thing, is you can look back at the history of your Kanban board, and you can see various things that have happened in the past. Now, we haven't got previous versions of it yet, so that's hard to see. One of the things we wanted to test, though, with this was to see how the history worked. And then there are other options available to us. We can, for example, display settings, and we can go to the settings, and there's an interface that gets built for that, and there's a bunch of options available there. So it's a product that has a reasonable amount of richness, and it's kind of good for a testing class in that respect. So there's our little, sort of 2 minute or so introduction to CryptPad Kanban. Now, around this time, we met a fellow, James Bach and I did, named Michael Mintz. And Michael is the author of a test application framework. He calls it a test application framework. It's a web application framework called Selenium Base. And the history of Selenium Base is that it provides a wrapper around various functions in Selenium and a bridge to a Python library called PyTest. And it has a whole bunch of features to make that easier for people who are engaging in the process of trying to automate a GUI and use it for testing purposes. And there's new features being added all the time. Michael's been working on this diligently for about the last 8, 9 years or so, maybe as long as 10 if you count his time back at the, I guess Selenium itself is 10 years old. Michael, I believe, was starting to work for his company. He told us a little bit about this in the speakers chat last night. And his company allowed him to open source it, which is really wonderful. And so it's got a very rich set of stuff available for bridging these various technologies. Selenium itself, web browsers, Chrome driver, PyTest, the Python programming language, and so on and so forth. And it's got fairly rich documentation, although we'll talk about issues associated with that. Anyway, Michael approached James and had been watching a bunch of his YouTube videos and reached out to James because Michael wants to develop his expertise as a tester, and he wants to develop his reputation as a tester. So he introduced us to Selenium Base, and there's a set of features for it here. It's got all this stuff. It also has support for lots of different national languages, command line interfaces, logging tools, global config file, website tour builders so that you can start an activity in a website and walk people through it. It's pretty cool. It also has a tool to export Catalan recorder scripts into Selenium Base framework. I probably won't get time to talk about my experiences with Catalan recorder. These experiences were not great. So Selenium Base is considerably more powerful than that. James had some questions from Michael. He asked Michael, isn't it common for automation through the GUI to break as people continue to build a product that's being tested? Also, James points out, he notices that when people build automation through the GUI, it's usually very simplistic kinds of scenarios. And Michael says that the automation doesn't break as long as the CSS selectors are well defined. He says, I write the automated scripts that cover the full range of web apps. Now, that's a sort of interesting perspective here, because notice how different people have insider and outsider views of technology, and those insider and outsider views influence their perspectives. They influence the very notion of what constitutes a browser or a browser element. For instance, here is what a civilian, a regular person, sees when they get to Google. And they don't even think of this as a browser element. They just think of it as a search box. From the developer's perspective, what's going on here? From the developer's perspective, there's a whole bunch of stuff that if you click on this little icon up here, and then click on this little search box here, what you'll get is a reference to that. And there's a whole bunch of data associated with it, including an input ID and the type of the thing. And notice there's an ID selector here, and it's part of a div that has an ID around it and all that kind of stuff. Now, the selector for this, according to the developer tools, for this item here is something more complicated, perhaps. Like, for example, in LinkedIn, here is the selector for that load previous replies thing. Now, that probably looks to you like a text link, and it looks to me like a text link too, but it's not. It's secretly a button. It's secretly a button. So what the user sees and what the tester looking from the outside sees is different from what the technical tester and from what the programmer tester thinks of. And the way the programs are designed are sometimes kind of unfriendly to that. Oh, and by the way, as I was looking at LinkedIn, I noticed this. I noticed all these errors up here. And if we go to the console and have a look at them, what do we see? A whole bunch of errors where we've got Chrome extension invalid, invalid. There's looks like there's 193 or so of those. And here's something that's interesting, I think, from the perspective of different worlds. And I noticed this just yesterday, so it just got added to the talk yesterday. Notice how it says something really helpful here. Invalid is blocked. Huh? what is invalid and what is blocking it. Requests to the server have been blocked by an extension. Wait, well, requests to which server have been blocked by which extension? This is not very helpful. I've got 15 or 20 extensions on my system, at least, and it says try disabling your extensions. Well, this is not going to help when I'm trying to troubleshoot and debug. I'm going to have to go through a world of pain in order to do this. So that's kind of my point here, that we're looking at things in the browser and in the source code and so on that represent different things to different people. And in the world of sociology, that object which takes on those different interpretations is something called a boundary objects. Things that afford different interpretations to different social groups are called boundary objects. Now keep track of that because I'm going to come back to that point. James, in response to Michael, points out that when apps are developed, there are lots of different kinds of changes. It's not just the consistent naming of IDs and selectors. Things get moved around to different screens. People use the product in different ways and for different purposes. People with different levels of experience and people in different social groups. And that's what testing is all about to James. So automating the GUI, James says to Michael, he's found to be a big headache. But yes, it is less of a headache when the product is designed in a more testable way. And Michael's response to that is, yes, okay, it can be a headache when apps are rewritten and tests need to be updated. When Michael says tests, I'm thinking in terms of what he probably means in our lingo is a check. A check is the operation and observation of a product algorithmically, such that it could at least in theory be done by a machine, and these days usually is, and then the application of explicit decision rules to the output of those observations, right? When we look at the output of the product of the operation, we observe the output in some way, and then we apply a decision rule to that, and then we report those outcomes, the outcomes from the decision rules, algorithmically. That's different from testing. That's a part of a test that is inside a test. And that is something that we call a check, something that can be done entirely by a machine. All right. So a test, in order for it to be a test, we have to go into it with the intention of recognizing a problem. We have to apply an oracle that not only checks whether the output is correct or not, but we also have to consider whether, if the output is incorrect, whether that's a problem. Because sometimes the output can be incorrect, and that's not a problem. And sometimes the output can be correct, but there's still tons of problems around. So let's remind ourselves that what the machine is doing is only part of the test, and it's the part of the test that we call a check. So Michael goes on to say that the trick is to structure the test scripts, the check scripts, in such a way that minimizes the time to fix a script. And then depending on the app and the team that develops it, it could be a little or a lot of extra time to account for updating the scripts. Well, that's true. And it occurred to me only just yesterday that there's maybe a different way of thinking about this, because what will happen is that the development team, when it sees inconsistency from those scripts, will refer to them as flaky tests or flaky checks. But you know what? The scripts are doing the same things that they always did. They're not flaky. And the application is now doing something that it was intended to do, that it did differently before, when the intention was different, or maybe when the intention wasn't clear, or when there was a bug. Or maybe there's something about the environment that's inconsistent. Well, it is unfair, I think, to accuse the check or even the test of being flaky. It's not right to do that. What is flaky is the relationship between the elements in these things. And I think it would be fair to say that a flaky test is only flaky in the sense that somebody is thinking in a flaky way about it. People think in a flaky way about testing because they believe that inconsistency is something that is something just to be thrown under the table, something to be dismissed. But inconsistency is an important part of recognizing the possibility of a problem between our idea of the product itself, the environment on which the product is running, and how those things interact with each other. That's the flaky part. It is flaky to dismiss something as being a flaky check. That's my contention in my argument. So James offers Michael the opportunity to try out his framework, Selenium Base, on CryptPad Kanban. Make a script, says James, that builds a Kanban board, then moves the cards around randomly, and then randomly edits a card. Do that, he says, for 1,000 cards. And James is particularly interested in this app because he's teaching it in a class, and he wants to show his class how we might use a framework like this for stress testing, or for load testing, or for looking for inconsistencies or other problems in the app, and not something that's necessarily just the regular output check. If I type this, does the product show that on the screen? That's not a very interesting check. Michael Mintz enthusiastically grabs onto this idea and says, yes, I'll build a test script for that. And when I've completed the script, he says, I'll send you the link to it and a GIF of the partial solution. And this will be a good test of whether my framework can handle complex situations like this. So to Michael, this is pretty easy. The idea is pretty straightforward. We got our little sailboat. We've got the holy grail of the task here. And the sailboat goes across the water to the holy grail. And there we go. And we're on the opposite shore. Well, actually, it's maybe the boat should be beside the shore so we can get to the grail really easily of the test. Maybe I should change that slide a little bit. Anyway, Michael reports the next day. So this is really impressive to me because Michael is energetic, helpful, enthusiastic, eager. He's just a mountain of energy when it comes to this stuff, and we really respect and appreciate him for this because he did a lot of hard work. And he provided us with his report. He says he had to create a more powerful drag and drop method for the Kanban board items, but he got automation working on that part. No randomization, he says, yet, but that's the easy part. Now wait for this, because that is sort of interesting. Getting full interaction with the website components is ready. Now, notice what happens. Here's a GIF of his result, and then he shows us a link to the code that runs it. So here's what happens, because things blow us ashore, or off course a little bit. Notice that he said he had to invent a more powerful drag and drop method. So here's his GIF of the activity. Fires up a Selenium Base and the Kanban, CryptPad Kanban, and then he creates a bunch of slides. He dismisses that dialog. He edits the boards. He adds 6 items to the boards. There he goes. And then he moves them around, and there we go. He is able to do that. And that's the end of it. But there's a catch here. This code does not add 1,000 cards and move them around. It adds 6 cards and moves them around. But hey, it's a start, right? Now I want to make it really clear. I want to make it really clear that this is not a diss of Michael. This is not, we're not dismissing the work that he did. 3 cheers for him. He's super friendly, super helpful, super energetic. He developed a new drag and drop method for this task. This is the outcome of what Michael could do with CryptPad Kanban in 2 hours. Now, this is 2 hours of work, something that it would take a human, a minute or 2 to do. But it takes 2 hours to teach a machine to do just this much. On the basis of the fact that machines aren't people, and this interface is not designed for a machine, what Michael has done in its limited way is perfectly reasonable and understandable. The point is not that Michael couldn't complete the full task that James set for him. The point is that the mission is hard. It's not trivial. It's not trivial to get a machine to exhibit behaviors that a person would exhibit, even for somebody who writes a framework, even for somebody who does this kind of stuff full time. Also, notice once again that both the script and the GIF are boundary objects. in the programmer's world, the script signifies the completion of the job, more or less, because the script can work. The script can work. It can't do the randomization yet, says Michael, but that's the easy part. In the tester's world, the script may represent the completed job, but it may represent a point of departure for more work, a lot more work. As, for example, when we build this into a stress test. To the manager, to somebody who's observing both the programmer and the tester from a different world, this is a boundary object too. They're looking at this and they're saying, lo, there be testing. So the different interpretations that people have for this are important because it explains why managers believe, well, it's easy. It's testing is easy. Look, we can get a machine to do it. And the machine does it in 39 seconds. But to a tester, that's not a test. And to an automator, that's not the work. So these worlds are in collision with one another, and it's really important for us to recognize that. Now, let's have a look at what James replies. James says, wow, that's great. So did you have to update your framework, though? Is CryptBag Kanban doing something weird? Is it doing something unusual? Well, then James says, oh, by the way, 9 minutes later, I got errors installing Selenium Base. So I tried it again and it seemed to work. But he got errors installing Chrome driver too. Again, it seemed to work in the second try. But then when he runs PyTest dashboard, which is one of the things that Michael told him to run, it complains that it doesn't understand dashboard. Well, it turns out that there's misunderstanding going on here. And that is an element of automated checking and any kind of work really that we refer to as transfer cost. It is expensive. It is time consuming to some degree to take something that somebody who knows how to do it and transfer what they know to somebody else. And this is something that is not discussed. We're not talking about this stuff very much. When we talk about how wonderful automated checking is, we're almost always talking about execution time. We're not talking about development time. We're not talking about maintenance time. We're not talking about upgrade time for the scripts and to keep them in sync with the application that's being tested. We're not talking about transfer time, transfer cost. We're not talking about opportunity cost, which is the cost of doing all that stuff relative to the cost of all the other stuff that we could be doing. We are not talking about this in testing, and we really need to do this. I noticed, by the way, that Michael is, I want to emphasize that this is impressive work on his part, but it's something that is different from the world of testing as James and I see it. So James runs into these problems and reports them, and Michael, once again, very helpfully, very diligently responds really quickly. And notice something about the timestamp, by the way. Either James is up really late or he's up really early. This is 5:30 James's time. It's 8:30 in the morning Michael's time. So Michael is absolutely on the ball and helping us out and serving us. So inside the Selenium Base world, Michael has tacit knowledge that he in this case, relational tacit knowledge is what we call it. Knowledge that he could tell, has not told yet, and then he makes that knowledge explicit about Python and PyTest and Selenium Base and pip and their relationships and their interdependencies and Chrome drivers. And notice that James doesn't have that. Now, it's not like James is an inexpert programmer. James has been programming, starting an assembly language, writing kids' games in 1983. So James got paid for programming coming on, 4 decades ago now. That's a long time, but he is an outsider to this world. Well, it turns out that there are a bunch of missing steps in the instructions. It turns out that it's important to clone the GitHub repository and not just to download the specific samples. So James is sort of expressing his unfamiliarity with this. Now, I'll let this video just go by. Look at the number of I assumes, I thought, That's odd. These questions that James is asking. The README doesn't say. James says, I falsely assumed. And Michael says, I guess I assumed. So that sort of stuff is going on all the time. And it's part of the secret life of automation, the hidden cost of automation, the stuff that is not necessarily noticed. And I think it's important for us to talk about it because it matters. And notice that James says, well, I do Perl and R mostly. He needs to learn Python. Michael, once again, incredibly helpful here. That little exchange took 23 minutes. Now, notice there might be something else going on here. You might be bored by the details and the minutiae of this. For some of you, it's ordinary, routine, everyday life. For others of you, it's sort of incomprehensible because it's not part of your world. If you're not a technical tester, if you're not used to coding and programming and using tools in this way, it's also boring. And for that reason, we don't talk about it. And for that reason, it gets hidden. All the work and all the effort that it takes to learn this stuff and to wrap our heads around it, that gets hidden. And for non-technical testers especially, that's a real problem because it gets hidden in a way that is, shall we say, embarrassing. It's because of embarrassment. There's a certain kind of sense of shame that we're not technical enough somehow or other, that we don't know enough stuff about this. Well, notice what's happening. For James, and for our little project of trying to get the 1,000 cards and moving them all around, we're being blown off course a little bit because there are errors installing Selenium Base, there's errors installing Chrome driver, there's confusion over the repo, and we're getting blown off course. So James raises some more questions a little while later that same evening, I believe. So later he's playing with Selenium Base, and after cloning it and running install, he's got a couple of samples and all that's good. And now he's just starting to use it to scrape some data off the website. And he's a little bit uncomfortable with the level of documentation that Michael has provided. Now, once again, Michael is providing documentation from the insider's perspective, from the somebody who has got the curse of knowledge. Michael knows his stuff really well, so he's not as familiar with James is about the kind of problems that somebody not familiar with is going to encounter. And that happens with documentation all the time. Any kind of documentation is like that. We don't learn as much as we think we do from documentation. We learn by trying stuff, by interacting with it, by playing around with it. And we learn by talking to other people and immersing themselves in their worlds. I think we overemphasize the role of documentation in stuff. Documentation is a kind of a tool that we use in order to help ourselves learn stuff, but it's not the center of things. And it's very common for people in the technical world to direct your attention to the artifacts and not so much to the human interactions between things. So here's an example of a nice human interaction. James says, okay, I have a meeting now. After 40 minutes or so of discussing this and working through it with Michael, James says, thank you. And Michael very kindly, very helpfully says that he expresses appreciation. So the social aspect of this is really important. A few days later, Michael reports that he's shipped a few bug fixes, and there's new version of Selenium Base, and the dashboard is fixed, and the assert no 404s method is fixed, and that sort of stuff is going along, and James doesn't even know about the assert no 404s method, so that's sort of funny. A few days later, James tries to run the script for his students. It gets halfway through and it errors out. So James asks Michael, can you try to run it? He wants to know if there's a problem in the script or if they changed the design of Kanban to make it fail. He says, I suspect they modified the app. Now what's happening here? It turns out that there are timing differences between Michael's older Mac machine and James's Windows machine. That Windows machine is much faster. And so because of being faster, it has timing differences in the browser when the browser is trying to interact with this stuff. So what happens next? What happens next is that I get involved. A couple of days later, James invites me to play with Selenium Base, and James says, as an experiment, because he wants to see what this is like as worlds collide, James gives me basically the same kinds of instructions that Michael gave to James, and tries to see what happens for me. He says, try to set it up and run Selenium Base and Selenium Base examples repositories from GitHub without my help. He points out there's a Kanban example script in the examples that the guy Michael wrote for him. See if you can make it run and document how you failed to do that. So James is anticipating exactly what happens next, and I'm going to show you what happens next. What happens next, I'm going to show you an hour's worth of stuff at various times, 20 to 30 times the speed. And what you're seeing here is sense making, the process of me trying to make sense of what I'm seeing and trying to figure out this stuff with which I'm unfamiliar, especially the virtual environment stuff. I don't understand what that's all about, so I try to install it, and I notice that there's stuff that's not in the path, and some of my stuff is out of sync with other stuff. I'm using an older version of pip, so I'm wondering if I encounter problems. Is that my problem? So I try to be a good tester and take diligent notes as I'm going, and I'm getting these warnings. So I copy and paste them to make that a little bit more certain that I've noted the problem properly. And then so I run through, I look, create a virtual environment, try to type it. I get complaints that it's not on the path. So as I go through this, Selenium Base, I make virtual environments not on the path. At this point, I turn to the camera and I rant crankily about how tricky this stuff is and how difficult this stuff is and how nobody pays attention to it. So anyway, I've taken that out. And now you're going to see me trying to wrestle with this stuff. And I get a problem with the Windows path. You see, as it turns out, there's a UI for editing the Windows path, and there's a limitation on it. The limitation is that it only accepts 2,048 characters in that GUI for it. Now, there's a way of doing this stuff that is accessible via the registry. And I've forgotten about it. At this point, I knew about it, but I forgot that that's how you get access to the path. So I'm trying to change the path, and I'm trying to remember how to do it, and so on and so forth. But my focus is split on trying to learn about Selenium Base and learn about pip and learn about upgrade, because I'm not a Python guy either. And I'm trying to make sense of virtual environments. I'm trying to make sense of all this stuff. So you're seeing this at 30 times the speed. You're seeing essentially 1 minute go by every 2 seconds. And then there's all this other stuff, this string of error messages. Oh, and by the way, at this point, as I'm preparing the talk, my video editing system crashed. This is 2 nights ago. So I have to recover from that. And then I get all this stuff coming out, and it's wiping out stuff, and I'm updating my dependencies, and I'm looking at this stuff, and I'm thinking that the virtual environment stuff is important. It turns out it's somewhat less important than it is, but I don't know that at the time. So I'm trying to get this stuff upgraded, trying to get it upgraded, trying to get everything in sync with itself. And I think the virtual environment stuff is actually the thing that's going to solve this. So what do? I reinstall everything. You try to reinstall from a clean base, and then I look here and I look at the commands again, and I try to figure out what's going on, and then I type Selenium Base or S-Base, and it runs. And maybe it's actually installed. Maybe it's been installed the whole time and I didn't know it. All I had to do is click my heels 3 times and say, Dorothy, I'm not, there's no place like home. But anyway, and now something's bothering me because I'm seeing a little bit of flakiness somewhere, something that I can't quite understand, a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of inconsistency. So I go through this and I look at the path again, and I try to figure out how that goes. And I burn a few more minutes doing that. And because I'm thinking that maybe the path access will explain some of the weirdnesses that I'm still seeing. So I go through that and I try a bunch of approaches to try and get it edited and slimmed down, but it doesn't save if it's anything more than 2048 characters. So anyway, whatever I do, I document, and I go back to Google and I look at some stuff, and I go back to the Selenium Base IO site and I look at that stuff, and it's up and running, and it's pretty cool. Wow, this is kind of great. I mean, it only took about an hour to get it done, and that's part of the cost of doing business. But that cost is largely hidden to our managers, and it's largely hidden to the people who aren't actually witnessing us doing it. And I think as testers, we got to talk about that a lot more than we do. So I talked back to James. I get back to James. I said, so I followed the instructions as well as I could. I ran into all these problems, and I never got the Kanban examples working. And James says, well, did you get the special and different repository called Selenium Base Examples? because I couldn't find the Kanban examples. And I say, no. And James says, well, there you go. I said it was a different repo, but I didn't realize the significance of that. There's examples that are subs of Selenium Base, and then there's a whole Selenium Base examples repository, and they're different. And I didn't know that. Oh, but now that it's straight, it works. And I can run those examples. And there we go. Here comes PyTest, and I can run them for myself and on my own machine. You know, as a tester, I'm skeptical. You know, unless I see it, I don't quite believe it. So here I go. I'm going to run this on my machine, and it's running, and up comes the browser, and up comes CryptPad Kanban, and it appears, and really quickly at automation speed, there it goes. It deletes the cards. If you look really carefully, there was a dialog that pops up there, and dismisses, and hey, it runs. That's great. That's really wonderful. And wait, there is something else though. Let's see here. Maybe there's something that's going to get in our way. I'm rerunning this. What about the 1,000 cards? There were only 6 cards, not 1,000 of them. Let's have a look at what happens when we try to do that. So I adapted the script myself. I went into, as James had done this too, I went into a TextPad. I grabbed the Kanban test.py script. I took the 6 add items to the board, and I added 6 more. Now, I'm not a Pythonista, so I didn't want to get in the way of this. So I made a minimal kind of change, did it as lightly as I could. I just cut and pasted the code. So this is not the way I would do it. If I were doing 1,000 cards, I'd do it with a loop. But I wanted to be simple and see if I could just make this work properly. So I save that, and then I fire up the script again. Here we go. It says PyTest and Kanban. There we go, test.py, and it starts up. And the browser appears on my other screen. So I drag it on screen, and then it resizes all by itself. Turns out that that's important. It resizes all by itself, and then it starts running CryptPad Kanban. There, it builds it, loads it, and it's in progress, and it does all those things. Oh, look at that. It snagged the dialog even before the dialog fully came up there, the little pop-up. And there we are adding items to the board, and we add items to the board, and there we go. And it stops. Now, unless I had been watching that, there's something important that I wouldn't have noticed. What I wouldn't have noticed is the cards don't move. The cards are supposed to move around, right? The first 6 cards were supposed to move to different boards, or at least 4 of them were supposed to move to different boards, and that never happened. But look, the test is reporting as pass. This is why we would say this is not a test. This is not a test because what did not pass was the test. What passed was the completion of the task according to some principle. The task ended. What it does not tell us, because we didn't put in specific asserts for it, is that the cards never moved. The things that we wanted to happen in the test, those things didn't happen. And there's a reason for that too. The reason for that is that Michael never added any assertions, any checks to the actual activity. Now, again, this is not a diss of Michael. This is what Michael was able to do for us in 2 hours. And that's really impressive. After all this, the 3 of us had a chat. And we exchanged some stuff with Michael. First of all, the Selenium Base documentation is really rich from the perspective of the developer insider, as I mentioned. It's largely, though, in the form of comments in the code. And that makes it hard for the outsider to reckon where it is. The documentation is not set up from the perspective of somebody who's trying to solve a problem with Selenium Base. It's set up from the perspective mostly of its author. Now, there have been other contributions along the way, and Michael has incorporated those to try to help people through it. But it's still set up from the perspective of somebody who has experience with it, and less from the experience of somebody who is in a different world from that of the author. There's a lot of operating the product here. Well, a little operating the product, but there's not very much testing. There's no actual evaluation of the product here. And there's nothing that really reflects the experience, the rich, deep experience of people who are going to be using this software. There's no logging. And in fact, something that we view as testers as a problem is that Selenium Base logs success. Doesn't log success. Anything that happens during a successful thing, that's your own lookout. That's your own obligation to add. From the perspective of the developer, from a programmer, somebody who's performing this, who really cares that it worked successfully? But we want to look at this stuff and analyze it a lot of the time. We want to look at output from this thing and look at the activities and analyze them, especially if there was stuff like randomization involved, because that's going to be an important part of troubleshooting.
Hi,
The
Michael. Sorry
relation.
to
Yes, I understand. I got 5 minutes. I know. I know. It's going to be meet the speaker. I'm coming to a close pretty soon.
At 10:20, we have Mariam sessions to be started.
Yes, I thank you for the warning. So there's another problem, and that is that the relationship between the script and the product is incredibly brittle. If we resize that browser window by as much as 10%, the minimum amount you can resize it, which is something that real users do when they see a browser window that's too small for what they want to see, they'll expand it, and the script breaks when we do that. So testable design would help, but this stuff is hard for anything but very trivial operations. Anybody who's tried to automate the GUI gets to see this. Look at the differences between one version of Michael's script and the next. Look at those differences in sleep timing. Now, Michael makes the claim that Selenium Base handles this stuff automatically. And to the best of its ability to do so, it does. But browser technology and people who are building stuff are doing this in a way that is always pushing the limits of how the tools respond to it. I was using SAMI, the simple automation module for Internet Explorer, 15 years ago, and it was a problem back then. Look, they made a modification to SAMI back then that said you no longer use wait for document complete or wait for busy in your SAMI scripts. Well, Selenium Base handles that part too, but it doesn't handle those pop-ups that come up unbidden, erratically, inconsistently. Notice he's also got a tool. This is back in 15 years ago. For a tool that helps us write automation scripts like Catalan Recorder, and it works about as well as Catalan Recorder does these days, which from a testing perspective, it doesn't. Here are things that WebCheck UI code might need to deal with. And whoops, ooh, I missed that. Hang on. Where's my credit crawl? Come on. There we go. Here are the things that it's going to have to deal with. And just keeping a list of this stuff is time consuming and exhausting. All these different things. So here's what we're trying to say in conclusion. Last observation. Regular people, users of software, are outsiders to the world of machinery and code. The programmer brings those worlds together, the world of machinery and the world of people. And to somebody who's an outsider to the user's world, it can be, if you're a programmer, hard to see how users do anything other than, say, move cards around. The programmers focus on behaviors. The programmers don't focus on actions. I also want to say, whoops, I got to unhide this slide. Help me, quick. I also want to say that if you're programming, it's really seductive. It sucks you into it. And there's a big payoff. You get lots of endorphins when something suddenly starts to work. And I can get really soaked up in the programming, and I forget my tester head when I do that. And the problem with this is, since I got started with doing this, I haven't found any bugs in CryptBad Kanban other than bugs related to testability. And I think that's a big problem. So let me just say that in the world of people and the world of machines, we need something else. We need a tester who can bridge the world of people and the worlds of machines and the world of users and the world of programs with the world of problems and doubts. And this is a powerful argument for retaining and enhancing the testing role. Bringing these people together But remembering that we've got to be focused on finding problems that matter to people, and this stuff can be an enormous time sink and an enormous distraction, even for people who are really skilled at it. And we need to talk about that with our managers, because automation is not a magic wand. It's not a genie's lamp that you rub. It is a tool, and tools come with costs and dangers and risks, as well as powers to help us. That's it. Thank you very much.